So, this is going to be our presentation on the French Revolution. It's going to be put on YouTube for you guys to consult later on during the semester when we have our first test. So, let's just dive right into it. There are several causes to the French Revolution, some long-term, some short-term. The monarchy was its greatest enemy during the pre-revolutionary times. Louis XIV, who is considered one of the most powerful or successful kings in French history, had many habits and excesses that negatively affect the government and their spending habits. Versailles was this grand palace that was so popular and so beautiful by the standard of beauty at that time that it became the standard of palaces in the region. And Louis XIV was interested in consolidating France's power in the region. And so he fought a lot of wars, and that added more onto the national debt. One of his successors, his great-great-grandson Louis XVI, funded the American Revolution, which is quite popular in America, but ended up damaging France's economic health in the future because it cost so much money to support two armies. Louis XVI also called in a financial manager, a commoner by the name of Jacques Necker, who had very, very good ideas, but they were very unpopular at court because he advocated for the taxing of nobility. The nobility didn't like that so much, and they were able to arrange for his dismissal. The Enlightenment was a political and philosophical movement during this time period that was contrary to everything that had gone before it. It promoted rationale and reason and logic. It challenged old institutions like the church and monarchy. It challenged specifically the divine right of kings, where kings said that God gave them the consent to govern people and no one else. The Enlightenment thinkers advocated for the social contract, which believed that people had the right. People consented on who governed them. That God had no say in it. So next, we have some tensions that begin. We have two different timelines. We have a timeline that's Marxist and a timeline from a travel guide. And they're very different. They're different secondary sources. They have different biases, so we're going to look at that. So Marxist timeline is more detailed. It attributes Necker positively. It negatively attributes King Louis XVI, and it starts a bit earlier, and it uses different language, like proletariat. If you read through it, you can find some language that's very specific to the Marxist audience that it has. The travel guide is different. It's shorter. The bullet points are more abbreviated. It's kind of unclear because you don't know how things connect to each other. And the audience, of course, is different. It's a popular audience. It's people who are traveling to France and they want to learn a bit more about the culture they're going to be experiencing. So Jacques Necker, because of many famines and lots of unrest that was occurring in France, is summoned to Louis XVI again after his dismissal and, I guess, rehired in a way. And he advocates for the summoning of the Estates General. And that was a parliamentary body that had not been summoned in around 200 years. Because the kings had so much power, they didn't think they needed the other people to input. And so there are three estates to the Estates General. There's the clergy, and the clergy were not taxed. In fact, they could tax people on things called a tithe. Then we have the nobility, and they didn't pay taxes as well. And then we have the commoners, or the bourgeoisie, and they paid taxes to both the clergy and the nobility. And if you can see our population distribution, 96% of the population was the bourgeoisie, and the other 4% were the other two estates. However, in the Estates General, everyone had equal representation. So this sets up a lot of conflict, and we're going to see that because the three estates cannot come to an agreement. So there's deadlock, and eventually Louis XVI locks the Third Estate out of the Estates General taking place in Versailles. And so the Third Estate meets in an indoor tennis court, and they make an oath not to leave until they have a constitution written. And by August of 1789, they have one written. It takes a while for Louis XVI to accept it, and we're going to see why. So, due to the ineffectiveness of the Estates General, Louis XVI again dismisses Necker. Necker was very popular with the people, and so when he was dismissed, people got very upset. And on July 14, 1789, a mob of Paris stormed the Bastille, which was a symbol of French power in Paris. It held around 5 prisoners at that time and a lot of ammunition, which the French citizens felt like they needed if they were going to fight for their freedom. And so they broke into the Bastille, they tore it down brick by brick, they took the head of the Bastille and they cut off his head and put it on a pike. And this started a precedent of decapitating people who were contrary to the revolution. And then another story that you may have heard about the French Revolution is the let them eat cake. A rumor started in Paris that an advisor told Marie Antoinette of the conditions of the country and how everyone was starving because of all the famines, and she said, "Let them eat cake." This obviously would upset people if Marie Antoinette actually said it. Most historians believe that she did not say it, but it was instead made up to incite the rage of the French people. And so the women of Paris march to Versailles and demand that Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, his wife, come to Paris, and they're forced to comply. And so Louis XVI is effectively trapped in Paris and forced to accept the Constitution written by the National Assembly in the tennis court. And that document is called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And here's a link to the text. And this is a document that's far more radical than the United States Constitution. Article 4 gives a very broad definition of what freedom is, and freedom is so clearly defined in the Bill of Rights and in the United States Constitution. This is another very radical idea. It's the redistribution of wealth, which is something that our Constitution never had and probably never will have. It's a very communist idea. It's a very Marxist idea. And finally, this talks about every citizen having the right to participate personally, which means that they had a far broader definition of democracy. Citizens still meant men. Women still had no right to vote. But remember, around this time, when the Constitution was just being ratified, only wealthy landowners had the right to vote, and that democracy was not expanded for more people until the 1820s and 1830s. So there are several political parties in France. They're broken up into the left and right, like we have today. The rights were more conservative. They wanted to hold on to the older institutions like the church and the monarchy, and the left was more liberal, and they wanted more freedom for people. And so royalists supported the constitutional monarchy, and this was the initial government of France. That Louis XVI remained the king, but he no longer had absolute control. On the other side, on the left, you have the Jacobins, who believed in a republic, and they were completely against the king. They wanted Louis XVI out as soon as possible, and they were part of a larger group called the sans-culottes, and that means without les culottes. And culotte was a fancy pants, a fancy kind of pants that were worn by the aristocracy. And during the French Revolution, lots of fashion changed because fashion was no longer defined by the upper class, but by the lower class, by what could be made. And another political party to keep in mind was the Girondins, which were the moderate Republicans. They believed that a constitutional monarchy could work, and they were the government that was in power before the Reign of Terror. And the Reign of Terror, or also shortened to the Terror, was a period in the French Revolution that was quite violent. It lasted around 2 years, and it was led by Maximilien Robespierre. And the way they got to power is during the Revolution. The other monarchies of Europe were afraid of this democracy that was just near their borders, and so many monarchies declared war on the French government. The French people became aware that Louis XVI was completely in support of these invasions, and so they ordered for his execution because he was participating in counter-revolutionary and treasonous activities, and so he had his head cut off in early 1793. His wife Marie Antoinette was also eventually beheaded, as well as his children. The guillotine was the primary means of execution. It was considered the more humane way of execution because a firing squad, you're looking at the person while you shoot them. A gallows and a noose, it doesn't always break the neck, so it strangles someone to death. An executioner's axe doesn't always hit the right place. So a guillotine is a heavy metal blade that just cuts off the head. Simple as that. And a lot of these people were executed because they were seen to be participating in counter-revolutionary activities that were contrary to the revolutionary ideas that were outlined in the Declaration of Rights of Man. And so they were judged, whether they were guilty or not, by a revolutionary tribunal. And eventually this became a witch hunt. Anyone who was accused of counter-revolutionary activities eventually was killed. And around this time, around 31,000 people were executed. And this is not the most extreme estimate or the conservative estimate. This is one of the more widely accepted estimates. And so eventually, Maximilien Robespierre kind of overreaches. The people get tired of all the executions, and even Robespierre himself is found guilty of counter-revolutionary activities. And so he is beheaded, and the government that takes his place is called the Directory, and this kind of limps along for 4 years. Is never quite effective. It's almost overthrown several times. And it's a big reorganization of the French government because on the top you had 5 directors below 2 parliamentary bodies, and they had the final say in things. And they tried very hard to. They were in constant threat of being overthrown, and several times a officer by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte saved them. And one of the largest differences from this during this period was that it was far more conservative than other revolutionary governments because it was in response to the liberalism, the extremism of the Reign of Terror. And so now we look at the results of the French Revolution. Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power. He was elected consul in 1899, and then eventually coronated emperor, and that is considered the end of the French Revolution. Europe changed entirely. The monarchies, though they did not collapse because of the French Revolution. They gave their citizens and their subjects more rights than they had before. And this kind of results in eventually the fall of absolute monarchies in general. Nationalism is something that also came out. The French people now had something to identify themselves with. They were no longer people inside Louis XVI's country, but they were in their own country, which they created themselves. And nationalism is an idea that pervades Europe throughout the 19th and 20th century. And now we think about which revolution was more important. American Revolution came first. The American Revolution led to the creation of one of the most powerful superpowers in the 20th century. But it was different because, and also not as vital as because France fell. France was a monarchy, a kingdom that really, that wasn't a colony like America was. They also were in the thick of things. The fact that the French Revolution had lasted as long as it did, surrounded by all those monarchies, is something into itself. And eventually, the American Revolution was a revolution supported by a monarchy. It was supported by the French. So that is my presentation on the French Revolution, guys. I hope you learned a lot, and I'll see you in class tomorrow.